Hello everyone, so I just finished a big Blender project that I've been working on for a long time now, and that is this spaceship artwork in Blender. So I actually started working on this quite a while back, and I've just been working on it here and there in between working on tutorials, but I finally finished it, so I thought I'd make a breakdown video showing you kind of the process of how I made the spaceship. So this isn't going to be a tutorial, it's more just going to be like an artwork breakdown where I kind of show the basic steps, and I'm also going to go into a bit of the texture painting and the materials and some of the node setups for the materials and a bit of the modeling. And if you're interested in purchasing the finished artwork files, you can get that on my Gumroad store with the links in the description, and also if you join my Patreon page, you can get access to the artwork project files. So let's jump into the first step to creating an artwork, which is collecting lots of reference images and inspiration. So when I'm collecting references and inspiration, I like to make a PureRef file, and PureRef is a really great program for collecting reference images. So you can actually just drag and drop images either from your file browser or from the internet into PureRef, and then you can crop the images, you can scale the images, and you can rotate them around, and you can just set up a really cool reference and inspiration board. So if you want to check out PureRef, then I'll have a link in the description to the website where you can download it, and I also have a tutorial which I created a while back on how to use PureRef. You can check out that video with the link in the description. So I first just went online and looked at some different spaceship models that I wanted to create, and also ArtStation is a really great website for finding really high quality artworks, and also Sketchfab is a really great website that I looked at for finding cool spaceship models, just kind of zooming around the artworks. And I really like that Sketchfab has a 3D viewer in your browser, so you can look at the models and you can move around the models and look at them from different angles. Now, as well as getting lots of references and inspiration, I also wanted to sketch out some designs because I didn't just want to copy one artist. I wanted to use the different inspiration and reference that I found online and kind of use different pieces and different elements that I liked from the other spaceships to create my own unique artwork. So what I did is pulled out my sketchbook and I just did some very rough sketches. So here's the sketches that I did, and I just played around with some of the shapes and designs and made a few different spaceships until I kind of started to get an idea for the type of spaceship that I wanted to create. So for creating the cockpit and the large circular windows, I got inspiration from the Robinson helicopter. So the Robinson helicopter has these big, large circular windows, so you have a really large field of view. And also for the big beams, which kind of come out on the front, I got inspiration from the Jedi Interceptor. And I also really like the cool kind of sci-fi triangle fins on the Jedi Interceptor spaceships. Now, another huge inspiration that inspired me to try to create a spaceship in Blender is the video game Star Citizen. So I haven't actually played Star Citizen, but I've seen a lot of images online, and I've also watched some YouTube videos of other people playing Star Citizen, and the spaceship models are very cool. They have some really cool, sleek sci-fi spaceship models, so I got a lot of inspiration from looking at the spaceship models from Star Citizen. And specifically, there's a spaceship in the game called the Drake Vulture, and it also has these really large beams, and I really like how the spaceship looks, so I got some inspiration from that ship as well. So I jumped into Blender and I just started doing some main blocking of the ship just so I could kind of look around it at different views and see if I liked how the ship looked. This object is very low poly, and I also added a mirror modifier to the objects so I can quickly adapt the shape and just kind of see how the feel of the ship looks. So for example, I can go into edit mode and I can just like scale these engines down. I could like duplicate it, maybe make a smaller one if I want to. I could also like go into edit mode here. I could select this fin and I could kind of duplicate this fin, maybe move another fin right down here. Or if I wanted this spot here to be longer, I could easily just pull that out, make it longer or make it shorter. I could also just like play around with the shapes of these. So going into wireframe, kind of pulling this back, seeing how it looks. I could even try duplicating one of these jet engines and sticking it like right here on the bottom of the wings. So I think it's really helpful to have this blocking stage where you don't go into much detail, because if you start to get super detailed modeling the spaceship and then you decide you don't like something, it's going to be harder to go back and change it. But this way things are very adaptable because they're super low poly, so you can easily change the size and the shape of the model. So it's almost like you're doing some kit bashing but with low poly models. So once you have a very clear idea of the spaceship that you want to create, you can either use that low poly model to create the more detailed model, or you can just completely start over and remodel it. So this is the spaceship model without any of the extra details. So you can kind of see I have like this big piece here, this piece kind of has those beams coming out, then I have like the main cockpit which kind of has has this big circular piece here, and then the main base of the ship is kind of a cylinder. And then I've also got these engines here, so you can see I went into much more detail, again looking at my reference images to kind of get ideas for the shapes that I want to create. So I added some more details here to the back of the engines, and also added some cool engine pieces here. And then also right over here I started to add like some cool greebles and paneling, and this fin here I just duplicated it to make the other fins since it's very similar. And also like right in here I added like some little fin pieces right here, maybe that's like some ventilation. And going down underneath the model I also added like some different landing gear. I decided not to rig the model, but I still wanted to think about how the model might move around if it was rigged so it looks more realistic. So for example, maybe this landing gear could kind of move up here, and then on the back landing gear maybe this part would like move in here into this little hole here, and this spot here maybe it could like rotate and move up, something like that. So once that was done I added even more details and more detail objects. So for example I added these thrusters here. So I was thinking like when the spaceship is flying forward it would use these main engines, but then to kind of move around in space and to rotate it would need some other thrusters. So I added some thrusters here and also some down here and to the sides. And then I also added in a lot more paneling, so I added these panels here, also added like some cool grippy panels there, and I also added a door here. Again, I wanted it to be pretty practical, so I tried to think about how the pilot would actually get into the spaceship. So what I did is I added this really cool side door which kind of rotates, and then I wanted to rig this part just so I could kind of see how it would look like. So I just added this object here, and I just did a very simple rigging setup so I can kind of rotate this piece so you can see the door opens up. And so then the pilot would maybe like walk up some stairs here, then the pilot could walk across here and kind of step into the spaceship. And then just to make it even more practical, to open up the door, if the pilot wanted to open it up by hand, there would need to be some handles. So I kind of added these cool handles here using a curve object, so the pilot has something to grab onto when he's kind of climbing up on the spaceship. Also adding some cool tanks here, maybe these are like some oxygen tanks or some gas tanks or something. And if we go over to the front here, I wanted to add some really cool guns here on the front. So I modeled these detailed sci-fi guns, so adding lots of cubes to make it look detailed, adding these little cylinder pieces here to give it more detail, and I just stuck it in here on the front of the ship. I also added these metal beams here along the window, and then if I zoom in even closer, you can see I also added some little bolts there. And if I just select the window, let me just hide this window object, you can kind of see what I did here inside the ship. So I added some sci-fi screens because it is a futuristic ship. So I added these like screens here, and then they're on these mounts. And then of course there's the main controller right here with this stick or yoke. Now a common problem that I sometimes run into when I'm creating large vehicles or large scenes is it's very easy to get the size of the objects messed up. And so one thing that I really like to do to make sure I get the size correct is to add these little characters here. And I like to put the characters around different parts of the scene or the vehicle to make sure I'm getting the size correct. So what you can do is click on edit, you can go to the preferences, and you can search for rigging, and you can turn on this rigging rigify in the preferences. That way if you go to the add menu, you can go down here to armature, and then there's going to be some extra ones here, and you can choose this human meta rig. And so I just put this same character kind of here on the ground so I can kind of get the idea of the size. So maybe they like roll up a ladder and then the pilot can kind of climb up. Then I also put another character here kind of standing on this spot right before the pilot would get inside the door, so I can open up the door. And then also to make sure I got the size right of the interior, I also went into pose mode of this character, and I just kind of moved the arms and legs, and so I can make sure I get the size right, so the size of the monitors and the size of the seat. So adding some sort of character or some sort of reference point for the size is something that I definitely recommend if you're creating large scenes or large vehicles, because it really is quite easy to get the size messed up. So once the modeling was finished, it was time to do the lighting and the materials. And I do like to set up some basic lighting before I do the materials, so it's easier to actually see what the materials look like. So here's the final lighting setup. I kind of changed the lighting a bit later, kind of at the end once I finished the materials. But you can see I added a bunch of different rim lights and things. If I go into the rendered viewport mode, I wanted to have like some nice reflections and things to kind of light up the spaceship. And then also here on the world properties, I added in this Artist Workshop 1K HDRI. So that just kind of adds more realistic lighting and reflections. You can kind of see some of the reflections there of the HDRI, especially in that glass there. And I think adding in an HDRI is really really important, even if you still have other lights which light the scene, because especially when there's shiny objects or glass or metal, those objects are going to reflect the HDRI light. If I just get rid of this world here and then just add a new world and just make it like a gray color, the scene just looks much more gray and blank, and it doesn't look quite as realistic because the glass doesn't really have too many things to reflect. But using this other world here, it just has a lot more things to reflect, and there's different colors and things, and you can especially see it in shiny objects. So just little things like there's kind of a bit of a blue there and a bit of an orange, and it is quite subtle, but it really does add a lot to the scene, especially when you're trying to get realistic reflections. Now, when I was looking at references and inspiration, it seems like a lot of spaceships have maybe 2 or 3 main colors. So I decided to go with kind of like a gray color, but then a lot of the spaceships also have maybe a secondary or even a third color. Now, I really like orange, and I thought orange would look really good on this spaceship, so I decided to go with some orange plating kind of as the secondary color, but then most of the spaceship were just kind of some different shades of gray. But then there's some orange pieces here, some orange pieces just around the tanks, and then of course the orange pieces right here. Now, regarding the texture painting and the materials, I will be going into more detail in just a moment, but the materials are mostly procedural. So I did use some texture painting to kind of make all those little different bolts and sci-fi greebles. However, most of the material is still procedural, and what's great about it being procedural is I could just change the color if I want to. So I could just take this color ramp color right here, and I could make it like a blue color, or I could make it like a red color, or maybe like a green color. But really, I did like that orange color. I think the orange looked best on this spaceship. Now, as you can see here in the material setup, I did use a few procedural nodes like the ambient occlusion and the color ramps and also some noise texture just to add like some noise and dirt to the material. But I also did some texture painting. If I control shift and select this to preview it, you can kind of see I did some texture painting here. So it's kind of a gray color with some white and dark plating. And then I also did some more texture painting here to kind of add some dirt. So you can see I have these little bits of white noise here along the paneling just to add some dirt. And I'll be showing you kind of how I set up all the procedural nodes and how kind of this all works, because I know it looks a little bit complex here if you don't know what it's doing. But first, I'm gonna jump into a different Blender file and just show you how I set up the texture painting. Alright, so I've opened up a new Blender file. I'm just gonna use this cube here. Actually, let's delete the cube because you always have to delete the default cube. So I'll delete the cube and then we'll add a new cube. Alright, so I'll go into edit mode and I'm just gonna add like a bevel, a really quick bevel to this object and shade it smooth. Now, if I go over here to the UV editing, the cube is already UV unwrapped, so that's great. So I'll go over here to the shading and I'll click on new to add a new material, and I'm going to search for an image texture and I want to make a new image that I can paint on. So instead of opening up a texture, I'll click on new here and I'm going to call this sci-fi bump. So I'll just call it sci-fi bump, and then I like to do 4K textures. So I'll do like 4096 by 4096. Now here on the color, I'm going to make this a mid-gray color. That way I can paint lighter colors and darker colors, and then when we put that into the bump map, it's going to look like parts are popping out of the mesh or going back in. So if I click here on the RGB, I can make all these values 0.5. So it's right in the middle. So it's a mid-gray color. Now, because this is going to be a bump map, I want it to be higher resolution. So I'm going to check mark the 32-bit float and then click on new image. And also on the color space here, this is a bump map, so it won't be directly contributing to the base color. So we want to change the color space to non-color. Now the color can go into the normal, but then of course, to convert it to bump data, we need to add a bump node, and the color needs to be going into the height value. All right, so now what I can do is select the object and let's go over to the texture painting workspace. And here's the UV editor. I'll just make this smaller and I'll go into the material preview so I can preview the material. And also real quick, let me just jump back over here to the shading and I'll make the base color just a little bit darker so it's kind of a gray color, and I'll turn the metallic value to 1 and I'll just turn the roughness down. So I can go back to the texture painting and we'll go into the material preview. So you can see now it just looks like a metal cube. So we can now do the texture painting. I'm going to click here on the draw brush. Now what I want to do is create a new brush that I can use to texture paint all the sci-fi panels and greebles. So if you click right here on the tool, the active tool and workspace settings, you can click on this button here to duplicate this brush. I'm going to call it line brush. So now if you click on this, you have the original text draw and then you have the line brush. Now on this line brush, I'm going to scroll right over here to the stroke, and instead of the stroke method being set to space, I'm going to change change it to line instead. And then I can click and drag, and that's going to add a line. So if I paint with white, that's going to make it look like it's popping out of the mesh. If I take the color here and make it black and then paint, that's going to make it look like it's going into the mesh. Now it's a little bit hard to see right now, but if I go back here to the layout, let's go into the rendered viewport mode. So you can clearly see it now by moving this light around. So this looks like it's popping out, but then this looks like it's pushing back in. So let's go back to texture painting, and I'll go to top view. Now to make it straight, what you can do is click and drag, and then you can hold down the Alt key. And the Alt key is going to move it by angles. So I can drag this down here, click, drag over, hold down the Alt key, place it there, hold down the Alt key, click there, and then I could also do like a sideways one, and then I could also drag this over here. And then also, if you click right here on the color, I could make it white, and then what I could do is just zoom in and just click here, just to kind of add like some little bolts. Now another cool thing I could do is I could click on this button here to duplicate this brush, click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to like bolts. So if I now click here on the stroke settings, I'm gonna leave it set to line, but I can turn up this spacing here. So now if I click and drag, then when I let go, you can see it's going to add some bolts there in a line. Now another cool thing to change the colors, if I go back here to the shading, I can take this bump map that we painted and I can put the color into the base color. And let's go into the rendered view. So to change the colors, I can go to the add menu and I can just like search for a color ramp, stick this here, and then I can change these colors. So I might like drag them really close together so they're more contrasty. And then if I want to like flip the colors, I could. So let me flip the colors like that, and I can maybe make this like a gray color. And then this one here, I could either leave as a white color or I could make it really dark. So now you can see that kind of down here, this is lighter and then that's a bit darker. Now I also want to show you how I added the noise brush so that I can paint noise to make it look like dirt or grunge. So let's go back here to the texture painting workspace, go right here and change it back to the text draw, which is the default. And then I'll click on this button here, which looks like 2 pieces of paper, to duplicate that. And now if I click on this to rename it, I can just call it noise or dirt. So now to add the noise, let me scroll down here and open up the texture. Let's click on new to add a new texture. I can click on this button here, which will go to the texturing panel. And on the type here, we're going to change the image or movie to clouds. And then I can also drag the scale to make it a bit bigger. Let's also turn the depth up all the way so it's very detailed. Now before I paint this, I do want to add a different map. So we'll go back here to the shading. Let's go to the add menu and I can add another image texture. We'll click on new, and this one I can just rename to like dirt. And I don't need the 32-bit float, so I'll turn that off. And the color here, I'm going to make fully black. And I'll click on new image. Now to make this appear into the base color, I'll go here to the add menu and I'll add a mix color and put that after the color ramp. Now this dirt color, this can go into the factor, and then here on color B, this is going to be kind of like a dark brown color for the dirt. So now I can go back over here to texture painting, and I can turn down the strength of my brush. I can start to paint here, and it's just going to paint a bit of noise or a bit of dirt. Let's turn the size up, and then I can start to paint here, and you can see it looks like I'm just painting a little bit of noise or a little bit of dirt kind of on the edges. Now something else you can do is go back here to the shading tab, and I can take this bump node and duplicate it and stick it here, and I can put the dirt color into the height value to convert it to bump data. So now it looks really bumpy, but I could just turn the strength down to like a 0.05, so it's very small. But now you can see that as well as it looking grungy and dark, it also looks a bit beat up. Now if this is something you want to learn more about and you want to watch some tutorials that I've made, I have a couple tutorials which I'll have linked in the description. So the first one is called Texture Paint Metallic Maps and Edgeware. So I show you how you can actually paint on a metal object. So the object looks like it's painted, but then as you paint away, it looks like the paint on the metal has kind of been chipped away. And then I also have another tutorial on how to texture paint bump maps where I use this same method. So you can check out those tutorials with the link in the description if you're interested. And then of course, very important, after you are done texture painting, you want to go over here to the UV editor and click on image and click on save as, and just make sure you save that texture, because if you close Blender, Blender's not going to save this texture data, so you'll have to redo the texture painting. Alright, so jumping back over to the Spaceship Blender file, I just kind of broke up the node groups and I added them into these frames here so I can kind of show you what everything does. But let's start here at the beginning. So what I did is added this noise texture here. So you can see here's some noise which I added just because I wanted the surface of the metal to be a little bit noisy. And then I also added this ambient occlusion with a color ramp. Now the ambient occlusion is going to make these little details here darker, and then the outsides of the object are going to be lighter. Now I used this mix color here set to linear light, and I mixed the ambient occlusion and the noise together. And this way the noise is going to be where the ambient occlusion is. So if I zoom in here, here's a good example of where you can see it. So if I turn the factor all the way up to 1, you can really see the effect. So the noise over here is very subtle, but then right here, kind of in the crevices and cracks, the noise gets really dark. And if I turn the factor way down, now you can't really see it, and the ambient occlusion just looks very smooth. So by using this factor here, it makes it look like dirt has kind of been collected in the edges. And so the noise is where the ambient occlusion is darker. And then I also added this color ramp here, and this is just to make it even darker so you can see it even better. So you can see really right there, there's a lot of like dirt there in the crevices, but then the rest of the metal just has a little bit of noise overall. Now also using this greeble here, I texture painted this, I added a color ramp to make it more contrasty, and then I mixed it into the base color with this mix color. So this way there's just some little dark areas there along the metal. And then I also wanted to mix in more dirt, so if I Control Shift and select this, here's the dirt that I made, and I mixed this in with another mix color, and this just adds a bit more dirt. So you can see here it is before and here it is after. So you can see like right along here, I wanted a bit of dirt and grunge kind of along those panels there, and that is finally going into the base color. Now as for the bump here, this first bump here is using the greeble. So that greeble map that I painted, if I Control Shift and select this again, you can see some of them are lighter like these ones here, but then some of them are darker. So if I put that into this bump, you can see this piece here, it kind of looks like it's popping out, then this one looks like it's pushing back in. So that's what I did. And then I also added this other bump here, and this one is using that dirt noise. You can see there's just a little bit of noise. If I turn up the bump strength, you can see it a lot better. So it's just adding a little bit of noise and a bit of bump to the metal. So once I had this main node setup, I didn't have to remake the node setup every time. I just applied it to the different object, and then I duplicated it by clicking on this button here to duplicate the material. I deleted the texture maps and added new texture maps, and then painted that as well. And that way I didn't have to set up this entire node setup for every different material. I also wanted to add some more details to the guns. So you can see right here in the guns, some of these little blocks here are a little bit of a darker metal. I also added the orange, but then also right here, I wanted to add some cool lines. So for this here, I added this wave texture. So this is the procedural wave texture using the generated coordinates, and I had the wave texture going around in circles, and I plugged that up to the bump map, and I put the bump here into the normal. And so this way it looks really bumpy, but I didn't actually have to model those extra details. I just used a bump map. So here for this chair model, I used my procedural fabric material. I'll have a link in the description to that tutorial if you're interested in checking it out. But I have this fabric material set up as an asset in my Ultimate Blender procedural material pack. And so I can just open up the asset browser, and I can just drop this fabric material onto this object, and then all of the materials in my Ultimate procedural material pack are set up as a custom node group. So I can change the size here of the material. I can also change the different colors if I wanted to change the color of the fabric. And if you're interested in purchasing my Ultimate procedural material pack, I'll have a link to the product page in the description. And my Ultimate material pack comes with all of my procedural materials, plus I have updates with future materials. So when I create more materials, I add them to the material pack. Now I wanted to add a cool texture to the monitors. So what I did is went on to Pixabay. Pixabay is a free stock photo site, and I downloaded a bunch of cool sci-fi images, and then I just threw these images together in Krita, and I just created this cool sci-fi panels image, and then I just added this as an emission material onto the monitors. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something from some of the tips that I mentioned, and maybe this will inspire you to try to create your own spaceship in Blender. And if you're interested in purchasing the finished artwork project files to use as study material, or to kind of look into the blend file and see how I created it, or even if you want to use the spaceship model, add it into one of your scenes, then you can purchase it with the links in the description, and you can also get access to it by joining my Patreon memberships. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.